Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Dan is away on military leave right now, so we're going to bring back some of our previous shows that didn't make it to the podcast. We hope that you enjoy them. As always, we welcome your feedback. If you'd like a written transcript of the show, please email me at Karen, Karen, .cox, COX, at mail, MAIL, .wvu.edu, or call 304-234-3673. Thanks again for listening.
Originally, Multiflora rose was introduced. It was a concept of a living fence. The idea was introduced, I want to say, by Louis Bromfield up in the Mansfield area. And he had livestock, and what he thought would be an amazing thing to do is to create fences through natural barriers such as Multiflora rose barrier. And the livestock, particularly a cattle, won't eat it, so it would make a good living fence if it was dense enough. Goats do like it, so it's a wonderful way to control that biologically. But it is an invasive plant. You know, the concept was it grew well, it grew fast, and like most invasives, they had a good intention to start with, but when it was probably a little bit overwhelming, and it still is. That's a lot of times you see it just past the pasture field, like where the trees start in the forested areas. You'll see a lot of it just kind of basically blocking your ingress into the forested area. But that can move out of the forest and really be a problem, especially for pasture fields.
Yeah, and the thing with Multiflora rose is it is so voracious that it can grow in many different growing conditions. I've seen it in deep shade in the heart of a forest, and I've seen it in full sun out in a pasture field. So the issue with Multiflora rose is that once it gets established, it's very difficult to get rid of. You can't take care of it just by mowing, and it really grabs onto you and literally, and it's really hard to walk through if you're trying to go through a forested area, like Dan was saying, on the edges or deeper in. And the bigger problem in a forested condition is that Multiflora rose actually inhibits regeneration of our native tree species because it forms such a dense thicket that between Multiflora rose and bush honeysuckle and autumn olive and privet and boxwood and all those great things that we brought in for wonderful reasons are now causing us a lot of problems. These types of controls will apply to a lot of these woody species that we're trying to deal with to help protect our forest lands and also to help our pasture fields. So when West Virginia researched mechanical cutting, close animal grazing, they found that mowing 3 to 6 mowings per season for 2 to 3 consecutive seasons are required to achieve a plant kill. So you can mow, but it has to be very strictly done. So basically what you're doing is you're starving out that root system, and it's very labor intensive.
It can be controlled by mowing, and the idea is exactly what Karen was saying. With any perennials, there's always a root reserve that the plant needs to basically replenish itself year after year. And it will replenish that root reserves throughout the season, especially during the later part of the season in the fall, and it'll put all that energy back. But continuous mowing and prevention of those leaves to fully expand and photosynthesize will eventually basically spend all the energy that the plant has in its root reserves and kill the plant because it has no energy to live and it's never photosynthesized properly.
Yeah, but the key is to make sure that plant is going through the effort of creating those full new leaves, give it a chance to really get some leaves on it, and then you're going to chop it down again because you're trying to get it to use up those root reserves and then hit it before it can reestablish new root reserves. And this goes for any difficult to control plant, really. If you are trying to get rid of that perennial root issue, then you need to make it expend its energy.
And another way to control it is chemically, which is probably, I'd say it's probably one of the most immediate type results that you can get for something that's that aggressive. And there's various things you can do. And, you know, when you're thinking of the best way to decide what to spray and where, you got to think about the land usage. You got to think about what you could spray and what the limitations are after you spray. And also what kind of equipment you have, and cost is always a big one as well. But there are recommendations for different types of land. If you have grass pasture, typically, and we'll go into this a little bit more in depth later, but for grass pastures, what's typically recommended are things like Cimarron Max, Crossbow, which typically has a very low restriction in terms of grazing, Dicamba, Glyphosate, which is Roundup, Grazon, and Spike. And Spike is a pelleted form of an herbicide. So it's a little bit different, and maybe even a little bit, I would say maybe possibly easier to handle because you don't need a sprayer.
Now, there are limitations, especially for things like Spike. Spike is going to remain active in the soil for up to 10 years. So if you are planning to maybe change your pasturing system or maybe plant some trees, Spike is definitely not the option for you. I also want to make sure you read the label as always, but you want to check the label, especially for any grazing restrictions for these herbicides. You know, you don't want to go out there and kill off the Multiflora rose and then release your cattle into the pasture and kill them off as well. Or manage or if you're trying to sell your manure, you don't want to poison the manure with a persistent herbicide. So you need to make sure that you know what you're working with and what are the long-term consequences of that pesticide use.
That's true. And that is why there are various selections here. But for non-crop land use, things like fence rows, right-of-ways, and waste areas, there's an Acme Super Brush Killer, Cimarron again, Arsenal. That one would be one that would not be recommended for grass pastures as much. Brushmaster, Crossbow comes again, Dicamba, Escort, which is one that would probably have higher grazing restrictions, and again Spike. So and these are typically going to be selective herbicides, except for glyphosate. But most of these are broadleaf killers. So what Karen was saying about Spike, Spike won't kill the grass, but it will kill all the broadleaves that can possibly come from the area that you sprinkled that substance on. And it's persistent, which is reason why it works to kill autumn olive. Multiflora rose, excuse me. Probably would kill autumn olive as well. Yeah. But anyway, those selective broadleaf herbicides typically don't kill the grass, such as if you're looking at the lawn weed herbicides. Those, if you spot spray broadleaves, or even if you cover an entire lawn, typically don't kill the grasses unless the grasses are in certain stages, and that is going to be on the label. So Karen was right, and really think about how you use your land and read that label thoroughly, because you don't want to mess it up for future use. Near woods or desirable trees now, what they're recommending are Cimarron, Escort, and Glyphosate. Glyphosate would be one that would kill both grasses and broadleaves alike, and it has a very low persistence, unlike Spike. So near desirable trees, what they're recommending are things that aren't going to linger as long. They don't have a very long residual. Near streams or ravines, dicamba and glyphosate are typically recommended, again, because they don't persist. But there's always going to be a limitation on how close to a water source you can spray anything. So depending on how close it is to that stream, you might not be able to spray anything. And for sprays, we say sprays, but there's different ways to spray. There are foliar sprays, there are bark treatments, and there are stump treatments. And these are all different, and they're typically going to be mixed with different mixtures where you get the chemical suspended into something that you can spray it. But you're going to have to, and also the concentrations are going to vary as well. So pay attention to the way you want to kill something and how you're going to apply it.
Right. And so, for instance, if you're trying to get rid of your multiflora rose during the spring or summer, you're going to do a foliar type of spray because you're going to have most access to the foliage. And so the best time to spray multiflora rose, if you're doing a foliar spray, is going to be right just before flowering stage. So when it's budding or just the flowers are just opening, that's when you're going to have the most success with the most variety of chemicals. Now, some chemicals are going to be better for a basil bark treatment or a stump treatment. But if you are, in the heat of summer and you are really just chest deep in briars, foliar spray may be the better option for you. So know what you're working with. You can get in there with a brush hog and you can cut it off. And then you can treat the stumps. That's a lot of labor. And you want to make sure that you have an extension wand or a long-handled brush, because stooping over for an extended period of time is going to cause some issues on your back. And we all want to make sure that you are protecting your back when you are working out on the farm so that you can continue working on the farm without pain. All right, so protect your back and make sure that you have the right type of applicator for how you are treating your stumps, whether it be the basil spray, the basil bark treatment, stump spray, or the foliar spray.
And something else about the foliar sprays, especially early on in the spring, and I think we'd be all right, but you have to make sure that the plant has fully expanded leaves. Whether you're doing it in the spring or later in the fall, if you're doing a foliar spray, foliar is another word for leaf, foliage. So you want to make sure that you are spraying it at the proper time as well. And usually foliar sprays are going to be water-based, and the basil bark treatments are going to be oil-based, or the stump treatments will sometimes be either or depending on how soon you can get to it. So the stump treatment would be actually mechanically cutting it with a chainsaw or some kind of saw and then treating that stump that's left over. Usually it works best for things that are a little bit woodier. Multiflora rose doesn't have a very thick stump, and all those briars and everything are kind of a nuisance. So foliar sprays, maybe in that case, would probably be a little easier to handle than something like when we talk about autumn olive. That one does have a thicker stalk, and that one also doesn't have the briars and thorns and everything on it. So it's a little bit less of a nuisance when you're trying to cut it down. But you do want to follow the recommendations and the dilution rates that's recommended for foliar sprays. And also in that foliar spray, when you're reading the label, there's going to be different concentrations that you're going to use for different types of plants. And multiflora rose, for instance, is going to be one of those woody type invasives. So you want a woody type concentration for something like multiflora rose, not something like herbaceous weeds.
And tell me, Dan, where can you find the concentration that you're going to need for the specific chemical you're planning to use?
On the label itself. And the label itself will always be attached to the container. We do have some time frames that we did different sprays. But let's kind of go ahead and go through the season. Let's look at May and see how effective things are and how much they drop off throughout a foliar spray type treatment.
Right. You're looking at if you do a foliar spray of, let's say, dicamba, store names would be Banville, Sterling, Oracle, things like that. So if you're treating the foliage at this time of year, April through June, we'll say, you'll get a pretty good success rate. But if you were to try to do a basil bark treatment or a spot concentrate, that's not going to do anything. So that's something you want to save for more the dormant time of the year, January, February, March. So if you're going to try to go for, say, glyphosate with Roundup, Touchdown, Glyphamax, foliar treatment, this time of year, you have a really good success rate. Also keep in mind that it's a non-selective herbicide, so it's going to take everything out. So when you take something out, you got to put something back, or Mother Nature will put something else back that you don't want. So do make sure if you're leaving these big grassy or big blank areas of open soil that you are reseeding rather quickly so that you can have what you prefer to grow in that area as opposed to whatever Mother Nature can put in to cover up that open area.
And that's a really good thing to think about in terms of figuring out what you want to use to get the kill. And like, remember we were mentioning the different chemicals, and we were saying something like spike has very long residuals. So if you wanted to put something in there that was a broadleaf, such as even maybe clovers and alfalfa possibly, or just other shrubs in general, spike would not be one to clear the olive, I keep saying that, the multiflora rose from that specific area. But something that has a low residual would probably be a good idea. And honestly, if you're looking at something like dicamba, you will notice, according to the literature here, that the efficacy of that product is really going to drop if you wait until later in June to do certain sprays. So dicamba would be one that wouldn't harm necessarily the grass, but glyphosate is one that would actually kill everything it touches. So be careful with drift for either or, but for glyphosate, you could be damaging the grass as well. But Karen's right, you're going to have these open spaces, and there's going to be different times that you can actually get back in there to plant seeds. So take that time, plan everything out, and chances are you'll have success if you thought it from start to finish.
Yeah, and also keep in mind, again, about what you're doing with the area that you're treating. If you're planning on grazing it, then you don't want to use a chemical like imazapyr or arsenal because it is not certified for pasture use. So while it's got a great effectiveness for a foliar spraying against multiflora rose pretty much for the entire summertime, it is not something you can use in a pasture field. If you're using methylsulfuron methyl, which would be Cimarron or Escort, you can use it as Cimarron in a pasture field, but you can't use Escort in a pasture field. So do make sure you're paying attention to the label and whether or not it is labeled for pasture use if you are going to be turning animals into this field after you've treated for multiflora rose. So you don't want to get rid of a weed and then find out that you can't use that area for what you wanted to use it for.
And something else that is kind of a newer concept that not everybody's familiar with is when you are using a lot of these products and you are using it for something that is full grown and fairly strong. If you have a bad multiflora rose infestation, that plant has deep roots, and it's a good idea to read the label and also think about adjuvants that you can use and like stickers, something like ammonium sulfate, for instance, that if you read the label will tell you a concentrate. It's and I don't remember, it's about a 1% solution typically. And what the ammonium sulfate does is it helps break down some of the hardness of the water and makes the glyphosate molecule a little bit more active in terms of being able to penetrate the plant a little bit better. So adding things like adjuvants and stickers and things like that to sprays is a great way to make sure that they work so that you don't have to come in twice with a spray. It's going to be cheaper, it's going to work better, and it's going to be a lot less time consuming for you. So think about the best way to get the best results with the least amount of effort, because that can make all the difference between something like a 70% kill and a 100% kill. And that 30% difference could really mean whether that plant will come back and just reinfest everything, or you'll have success in removing it, and then you could do the follow-up projects that you have. So Karen did talk about Cimarron and Escort, but let's go ahead and talk about spike for a minute. Spike is going to be soil-applied pellets. It is going to have... There's very few woody species that are going to be tolerant to it, and it can move in sloping ground and affect desirable plant species. So just because it's a pellet and you put it in one place doesn't mean it won't move. And it is persistent, so make sure that if you are using something like spike, you really read that label and make sure that it's not going to interfere with future plants that you have. As far as like a pasture label goes, it's got some restrictions, but you can actually... Spike would be one that isn't too restrictive, but think about what kind of animals you have, whether you have dairy or whether you have beef. That's going to make a big difference, even if it's something labeled as pasture friendly. Because you have a dairy animal, whether it's a dairy goat or a dairy cow, that might be an issue. And you might have to do things differently. And again, you don't have to necessarily spray if you can get in there with the mower. And we did talk about some of the research there and some of the ways you can do it. About 6 mowings a season, right, Karen, for about 2 years is what the research says. We'll spend the root reserves and we'll make sure that you knock those multiflora rows pretty low. Also think about a hay field versus a pasture field. In a hay field, you are mowing it and you are keeping that plant from growing too big. And it is a way to kind of keep it from overtaking a field as fast as a pasture field. Because in a pasture field setting, yeah, your livestock's grazing, but they're grazing around these plants, so you're not going to get it cut. Things like grazing and then following it up with a mowing might be something that might work as well. And then we'll go ahead and there's always trichopere and crossbow are two things that you can use both as a foliar and a basal bark. And the thing with crossbow is that you're going to use those two things at completely different times to get effective control of multiflora rows. Now is the time to use it as a foliar treatment. So chances are you're going to dilute that crossbow with water. And for the basal bark treatment, it's something you do when the plant's dormant, typically from January to March. That's something to consider for next year. And that might be either a different formulation altogether, or at least something that you're diluting that chemical in a different substance, because you're not going to get good penetration of the basal bark with something like a water-based type herbicide. And when I say this, doesn't mean that if you're careless with your Roundup, doesn't mean you won't kill the tree eventually, but it's typically not as good, and you typically need a more hydrophobic type substance like oil-based as opposed to something water-soluble to get good control. And again, always think about those adjuvants and those other things you can do, stickers and things to make the product more efficient. 2,4-D dicamba. Products like Acme Super Brush Killer and Acme Brush Master are not recommended for pasture use. They're also going to be different in terms of when you're going to do the foliar sprays and the basal bark.
Yeah, and also the thing with the 2,4-D dicamba mixtures is that they are not as effective on multiflora rows as some of the other things out there. So if you are going to use a chemical control for multiflora rows, you really want to stick with maybe the methylsulfuron methyl, the glyphosate, or the dicamba. Those are going to be the ones that are going to give you the least amount of restrictions as well as the best control. So there are some other mixtures out there, but they're not approved in all states. So we're not going to go over them because we know this does get broadcast across state lines. So radio waves do not pay attention to state lines. And so that's why we try to keep this a little bit more generalized.
Yeah, and that with that point made, I'll always look at the label to get specifics, because even the same products, different companies might have different formulations, and then they'll have different dilution factors and possibly even different concentrations. So look at those very specific things when you're looking at a label. And keep good records too, because not only for possible future usage, but also you might treat 1 year with a chemical that worked really well, and the following year you might do something that you think will work but doesn't work. And if you have good records, you can figure out maybe why one worked and one did not work.
Right. Yeah, definitely make sure that you're keeping track of any sprays or chemical applications that you do. That's a very important thing to do. But as we get close to the end of our time here, we just want to go over real quick that foliar sprays are for when the foliage is out. And if there's no foliage, then you want to use a dormant basal spray or basal oil treatment or a soil treatment, because that's where you are actually getting it to go straight to the root system of the plant. So if there are leaves, use the leaves. If there are no leaves, use the stems. And that's basically when the things are most effective. It's nice for the plant to tell you when to use what different treatment. There is something out there right now called basal rosette disease, and I want to make sure that we touch on that. So if you have a multiflora rose rosette disease, that isn't looking too healthy, maybe a little bit shriveled around the edges, maybe a little bit of discoloration on the flowers, it more than likely is suffering from I can't even say rosette disease, and it's vectored by a little mite that just kind of flies around or crawls around and gets on different plants. But if you see that, then leave that one. Take out the healthy ones around it, because we do want this the disease to be able to take out some of our more widespread populations that are inside our forest lands or in less treated areas. So that might be one I would leave behind, sort of like you leave the caterpillar with the egg sticking out of his back. It's a similar concept.
Only caution to that is that rose rosette disease will also affect your hybrid tea roses and your knockout roses too. So if it's close to the house and there's a lot of rose shrubs around it, you might want to actually get rid of that one and make sure you move it away from the house. So there is that little hiccup on the rose rosette disease can really knock it down in certain areas, but it will affect your ornamental roses as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Dan. And also keep in mind that the diseases that affect roses can also affect your cane fruits. So there are certain situations where, you want to make sure you eradicate vectors of outside diseases. So there's also a rose seed chelicid that enjoys feeding on the Multiflora rose. It is spread by birds, and it's basically a little wasp that lays its eggs in the seed of the plants, and then the larvae eat the seed. So therefore, it can't reproduce by seed. It's spread by birds because the plant itself spreads by the birds eating its seeds. So there we are on that one.
All right. And we're pretty much out of time here, but hopefully we gave you some good ideas in controlling Multiflora rose. And if you do have questions, feel free to contact us at the Extension office. You can contact me at the Belmont County Extension office at 740-695-1455.
And you can contact me at the Ohio County Extension office in West Virginia, and it's 304-234-3673. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.